Alright, good morning. Welcome to the stream. Today, a little bit later than yesterday, but we're getting there. Tomorrow's probably going to be an early one as well, or a shorter one as well, and we'll see where we end up with that. Things I learned out of yesterday is I need to work on this mic setup. It was good for gaming streams, but in terms of this spoken word stream, I need to use the better mic. Because this one's a bit muddy, bit clipped. I think I need to look at the settings and the fact that it's a headset mic. So things like, because it's going to sit on the lips, breathing tends to get caught up as well. So we'll be fixing that in the near future to try and make the audio capture a little bit better. Okay, so what do we have today? Well, bring ourselves into stream. Not a lot, but funnily enough, a lot of what we are talking about is the stuff we've been talking about the last day or so as well. Okay, just before I went, well, live-ish, in the last little while before I went live, I saw this pop up, and okay, it needs to be made larger. There we go. There's been a new drop of Epstein-related records. Now, whether or not it's the same details as has previously been released, I don't know. I don't know that anyone's had the time to go through the entire data set just yet. We're looking at, yeah, it's going to be, okay, let's say, let's go to the last one and have a look. Okay, a bunch of MP4 files. I wonder if these are the submissions, not submissions, but depositions that were taken. Quite possibly. Let's go back again. Let's have a look maybe at, well, this may not go very well. Okay, last modified, it's most recent. Let's have a look in here. Okay, TIFFs and JPEGs. Let's go that one. Right, okay, so 2023. So this looks like it's, well, partially the Ghislaine Maxwell case. I mean, it says there on the screen. I suspect that there's plenty of other stuff too. But this would be interesting because I was pretty sure that this had been denied for release previously. I don't know who has how the authority to release has been received. Okay, yep, it's right. The timings, the date, filed in 2020. So this isn't. Can I go to the next one? Yes, I can. Okay, no, still um, talks about Maxwell. It's Maxwell's case here because they're talking about the bail application, as it says there. Uh, Media frenzy followed Epstein's death. So this is obviously post that. Uh, Recognise, regardless of the defendant's reasons for taking these steps, that course of conduct clearly establishes her expertise at remaining hidden and her willingness to cut herself off from friendly family and friends uh, to avoid detection. Right. Um, that's actually kind of interesting reading that. Okay, so clearly that one is to do with the Maxwell case. Let's just go down to the bottom, see what we can pick up down here. What's that got to do with anything? Why is coronavirus? Are they just doing a dump? Because that seems odd. Unless it was to do with a reason why she couldn't be contained. All right, okay. So it looks like there's just a lot of um, procedural type stuff. I dare say that the bulk of whatever's been released is, yeah, procedural back and forth, like access to material for discovery, routine type, discovery, etc. Okay, motion to dismiss. Yep. Okay, fair enough. So basically, this is her team, her lawyers saying, look, dismiss the charges, various motions. Okay, I mean, again, it's going to take a while for people to dig through and find, I guess, anything salacious. I don't know that there will be, but we can certainly have a look. So let's have a look. Get to page 1. Okay, improperly joint trial. Okay, materially for civil deposition, defamation. Virginia Roberts Jeffrey. Okay, so the argument appears to be um, allowing, was it counts 5 and 6 to be argued at the same time as 1 through 4 would poison the pot, poison the well, and bring unrelated accusations as far as her team is concerned. Okay, and so they're arguing that the perjury is different to, unrelated to the uh, trafficking allegations. So I think I mean, given that the material's only just dropped, I'm sure there's going to be stuff to come out of it. But at least the bits I just had a quick look at, I don't think there's going to be anything new in them. I mean, it's great that it's been additional material released. I suspect it's the um, I suspect it's the mostly the court material that was previously requested to do with Maxwell and her uh, prosecution associated with it all. It would be interesting to see as people dig through it deeper whether anything does come to light. I doubt it, but we'll see. We'll see. It'll take time. All right. So one of the things that came up, I was surprised to see it not appear on, well, at least not appear in the international news in Australian media, was discussion about the US deployment of warships off the coast of Venezuela uh, to, well, provide maritime security in international waters. And there was the expected complaining that this was unnecessary militarization, this was a threat, this was an escalation, all those sort of magic words. But even though this is a CNN article, it wasn't really picked up via CNN. It was like awareness to it was picked up through other channels and that then pointed back to CNN as an, well, not so authoritative, but uh, a media source that was covering what took place. The given that the US has been present militarily, navally in the Middle East for, well, many decades at this point, the use of small boats and smuggling and things like that isn't a new thing that they're just encountering. And so I don't believe the standard practice is to attack small boats in other regions when they approach or pass by naval vessels, even if they are smuggling and things like that. The attack here, interesting because, well, it's US Navy, not Coast Guard. The Coast Guard normally have a lot of responsibility for drug interdiction and maritime security in those regions, and the like off the southern US coastline. So the attack here, well, killed 11 people, but basically it was an attack on a small boat, and um, well, yeah, I think I wouldn't necessarily, well, I would call it a cigarette boat purely because it looks like it's a go fast. Wondered why they had 11 people on it though, but also I doubt it was going all the way to the US from Venezuela. I mean, it could have, but it's a long way for a boat like that to go. So that was interesting that it took place as a counter drug mission. Um, a precision strike, well, I guess it's the difference when the Navy goes and does things as opposed to the coasties. The coasties do have weapons and can uh, stop vessels like that, but it's interesting to say that. Interesting that it was undertaken like that. Now, the US claims they were related to cartel operations. More than likely they were, given that it's likely to be a drug boat. But again, it's forward operations. Okay, obviously you want to stop them arriving in your own waters and things like that, but this is taking it. It's still in international waters, but it's a forward projection of force against the drug trafficking trade, etc. So yeah, that's an interesting article, and I'm surprised that it didn't get a lot of coverage anywhere else. So okay, um, we've got a lot of articles that have popped up, um, or that I read and decided to talk about that tie into stuff I talked about yesterday and talked about previously. But before we do that, I think I'll grab the BBC article here first, talking about how the US federal judge Breyer. Now, got to be careful with this because if you look up uh, Justice Breyer in Wiki or Google or anything like that, there's a couple of Justice Breyers out there, one of whom uh, was associated with the Supreme Court. That's not the one um, who issued the ruling in this case. The one who issued the ruling in this case is a senior federal judge in California, Northern California, Ninth Circuit. I'm not 100% sure of the circuit, but it's, well, it says a district judge, but they're specific to one of the circuits that incorporate California. As an Australian, I find it odd that judges will often be seen as ruling along ideological lines, and that there is something to be taken from who appointed them. Obviously, when Trump was in power 2016 to 2020, and he got to make the Supreme Court appointments that he did, there was a lot of complaining across a range of media about the fact that he was appointing conservative judicial appointments and that it would upset the balance of the Supreme Court and other courts. Now, the question there is, well, what was the balance before that? Uh, it doesn't seem, well, it depends on some of the cases that have been overturned, but externally it doesn't really seem, I don't think it's pushed the balance of the court one way or the other too far. It does seem they make relatively, like I'm talking about the Supreme Court here, they seem to make relatively balanced decisions, and um, there was certainly a possibility he could have appointed very hardline conservative judges to the Supreme Court, but they seem to be relatively moderate. They certainly don't vote along um, ideological lines as much as some of the other justices do, and that's interesting to see. Um, and I don't think the US Supreme Court ended up as polarized as people were fearing. Now, that doesn't just extend to the Supreme Court, it extends all the way down through the different circuits and everything else. People look at what president nominated and installed a judge in what circuit, what sort of cases they take, and will often point to them as ruling where it's not a strict legal ruling and they are in using some opinion to make a decision. They will often, it's pointed to that they often rule along ideological lines. Right, that said, Justice Breyer is, I don't know if it's justice is permitted, Judge Breyer, it was a Bill Clinton appointee. Plus, he's a senior judge in California. Now, the perception of California as a state, despite the fact it's got quite a lot of conservative voters inland, is predominantly seen as a very liberalised state. and so a judge that's been hanging around for 30 odd years is probably going to be uh, assigning decisions along that. Now, quick read of Wiki this morning to see what he was and how he voted. He's been involved in some interesting cases. He's involved in the case against VW, Volkswagen, for their emissions regulation cheat. I'll go with cheat. Basically, where they used software in the vehicles to work out when they're placed into test mode and therefore adjusted the way the engine burnt fuel to affect the emissions so that it was all fine and beaut, but when the vehicle was driven on the road, it burned fuel in a different manner. Now, everybody was cheating the tests. Well, designing to the test, and quite often the real world use case looked nothing like what was being tested for. But the problem is once you turn a measure into a metric, it stops becoming either. I think it's that way around. And so the good idea of we want to limit vehicle emissions and things like that, I think was a little bit unrealistic at times. Hence, the vehicle manufacturers kind of all cheated. I don't think it's collusion. It just so happened. And Volkswagen were the ones that got caught. Well, that got caught and prosecuted. I think others got caught too, but Volkswagen was nailed to the wall for it. And he's also been involved in a few other somewhat interesting decisions. Now, coming out of this, the whole reason for the case was brought by the state of California to complain that Trump's use of or deployment of National Guard troops in LA to protect federal officers against violence and um, damage during the LA riots was, well, fundamentally illegal, not permitted. Arguing against, I think it's Posse Comitatus was part of it. Uh, Now, the even the footage from people who were very much against Trump doing it in the first place, even the footage that recorded showed that the troops were effectively uh, limiting their response to the protection of the federal facilities and the associated agents. They weren't stepping out into the street, busting heads or pushing back riot lines or anything like that. And so it would appear that the narrow application of their employment fit with what the government said they were doing. The mere fact that they'd been rolled out was the problem, and that people had with it and felt that it was too far gone. Now, this is a circuit level judge who's then telling the federal government they can and can't do things. There is a lot of argument, depending on where you look. You'll see these arguments appear. Sometimes you won't. If people see the decision coming down in their support, they'll just argue that the government was doing the wrong thing all along. But there is an argument that the judicial processes are being applied at the wrong level. I mean, they're judge shopping and everything else. Everyone does it, but they're taking it to known liberalised judges in order to get favourable outcomes. But then the question is, does that judge have the authority to issue nationwide, or uh, do they have the authority to make a decision in that regard? Looking at what's been reported on, it seems to tie it just to the LA response. It's interesting to say. It's interesting to see that, well, not just the ruling being on hold till the 12th of September, but the well, it, I see it as a political stunt, really, by Newsom, um, because the government also put forward a constitutional argument as to why they were permitted to deploy the National Guard specifically in the roles that they did. Now, the whole thing of California officials argued their law enforcement could handle the situation. Well, quite clearly they weren't up to that point. And it was evident once the National Guard rolled out and continued to protect the federal facilities, all of a sudden everything evaporated. It was like the money flow got turned off, or the um, the desire to protest suddenly disappeared. No, not suspicious at all. Not There's nothing related. It's what the argument here is. But the there's a couple of arguments. I don't know that the argument that the illegal immigration processes counts as an invasion necessarily works. I do understand why they've made that argument. Doesn't mean I agree with it. I just understand how they've arrived at the argument they're trying to make. Just like I understand the arguments on the other side of the coin too. I don't necessarily agree with those either, but walking through the process that they've done and the arguments they've put forward, you can see how they've constructed the defence or constructed uh, the rationale to allow them to proceed with the action they've taken. And fundamentally, it's not until it gets tested in court, and in the government's case, it should be at the Supreme Court level, that you really find out how legal it was, assuming it's tied specifically to existing legislation. Otherwise, then you run the risk of legislating from the bench when it should be the Parliament slash Congress doing that. But if Congress is tied up and refuses to make a determination on it, you end up in a case kind of similar where Roe versus Wade, which had been passed down as a judicial decision and in the subsequent decades had never progressed to a legislative decision, and so was able to be reversed the way it did because it was fundamentally just a judicial decision and could be overturned like that. And so, I mean, personally, I'd always thought Roe versus Wade had been enshrined in actual legislation. I wasn't aware that it was just a judicial decision, which leaves it exposed like it was. And despite all the rhetoric being passed around by everybody in the subsequent years, no one seemed to have seriously taken the step to actually enshrine it into legislation. So read into that what you will. But I thought that was an interesting outcome from that. So, will this stand? I don't think so. I think it'll go to the Supreme Court. I think the government's case, the government's arguments are robust enough that the Supreme Court will probably come down 5-4 in their favour, and basically along conservative, liberalised um, ideological lines. And the I think the government was careful enough to make sure that they weren't sending the troops in to bust heads and sweep the streets, that it takes away the ammunition of the other side of being an overstep. Now, had they done that, yeah, it probably was an overstep. That would probably very clearly breach things like did I get that wrong? Posse comitatus. Commie possitatus. The posse comitatus. it's that narrow usage which I think is where the uh, resulting determination is going to be. Now, will they get the same sort of media coverage? I don't know. But this court finding has found its way in a bunch of overseas media. It was in a bunch of Australian articles today. And um, what was interesting, it talks about, yeah, so this last little bit sort of gives an insight into why or where Judge Breyer's decisions or intent on the situation seems to be pointing. It's when Trump initially took command or control of the National Guard in California there, Newsom, i.e. California's governor, tried to get control back, and Breyer said, yes, you did, but then that was overturned on appeal. So you've got prior history there in relation to the whole use of the National Guard in California by the government in this recent period where this judge has ruled against the government, that is the federal government, but it's been overturned on appeal, even without going to Supreme Court. So it's quite likely you're going to see the same thing again, even though this ruling's been passed down. It is suspended until on hold there until the 12th of September, and of course it's expected that the government will appeal. Now I don't know whether it's in this article, but there is it might be one of the Australian articles. Not only was it talking about the use of the National Guard the way they did, it seems to be tied only to the deployment in LA. And it said that the ongoing deployment in San Francisco was completely viable. So, yeah, interesting. It's like one thing, not the other. But, yeah, so we'll keep an eye on that. Interesting to see what will come out in coming weeks. It'll obviously take time to work its way through the um, appeals system. That's the word for it. Okay, so start heading back more to the Australian level stuff that I've been talking about previously. This one stood out to me in part because it was an SBS article, and SBS talking about this sort of stuff is interesting. It's interesting because of the topic and the outcome. Now, back in the day, ABC used to have a show. So the ABC used to have a show called Compass, and it was, I think, ran on Sunday nights, like 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock at night, with repeats during the week. Geraldine Duke used to host it, but it covered spirituality in Australia. So it wasn't just the Christian church, but it covered um, all faiths and um, aspects of spirituality and its expression within Australia, and did so fairly even-handedly. It gave people respect for their faith, and it also helped explain what the various faiths believed in or why they believed in what they did. Um, that was an ABC thing. I don't know if it's still running, but it was interesting to see the trends that were appearing and were reflected in things like the census about where Australia was heading over the last number of decades in terms of faith and things like that. The current, the most recent generations coming to adulthood, um, Gen Z, Gen Alpha is probably not far behind. A lot of the trend over the last 20 or 30 years was increasing secularization. So people moving away from formalized faith into a secular state, a position of non-faith. Not so much atheism um, or, I mean, they were more indifferent than anything else. Just trying to think what the word for it is. Uh, it wasn't, uh, um, yeah, I mean, some people went the hardcore atheist route, but others didn't. But the general trend was people moving away from organized religion. In the last couple of years, though, there's been a resurgence in not just religious belief, but the more conservative, people would say more extreme, more fundamentalist, more conservative elements. There's been a push, say, within the Catholic Church for a return to Latin rites, and there was a bit of a fight within the Catholic Church about the viability or the ability of people to attend Latin rites, and the popularity that it attracted, I think, eventually won out. And um, basically, it means going to a mass set in Latin. But it's not just a mass set in Latin. There are other aspects of faith associated with it. Just the most observable element of it is going to a church service set in Latin. The I guess the trend kind of tied in with people looking at things like cottagecore, homesteading, things that were perceived to be conservative slash right wing slash that sort of stuff. Now, it doesn't mean that they were, that's just how people labeled them. Uh, Problem with that is it then labels the other positions, it's talking about polarized understandings, as being one of zero faith or one of a disregard for organized religion. Bit hard to avoid the accusations of uh, socialist thought in that aspect, where a big part of a lot of socialist states is not just separation from faith, but a repudiation of established systems of faith, because it's another means of controlling and managing people. You can't have a means of controlling and managing the people that isn't the state. All right. That said, the trend observed and being observed, and it's interesting again that the SBS is bringing this up because of their general positioning as a liberalized network, one that by and large doesn't encourage um, organized religion. I mean, obviously there's elements of their foreign reporting and their access to foreign media services that will cover it. Um, but no, it's the almost the youth channel in amongst other things. So to see an article like this pop up was interesting. Um, yeah, okay, so there's a diversity in religious approach. It's interesting to see something like this where someone's come from who considered themselves a hardcore atheist, someone who'd moved away from any sort of faith when they were a teenager, as they entered their 20s, suddenly moving back into a form of faith. And you're going to find, if you look on social media, you'll find a number of voices that are no longer being suppressed, um, talking about this sort of stuff. Now, 5 or 6 years ago, or 3 or 4 years ago, before Elon Musk bought Twitter, these voices were often not actually deplatformed, but almost shadow banned. You would very rarely find people openly discussing um, a pathway like this. It was looked almost as as if somebody from the LGBT community had turned straight. It was seen as a repudiation of their liberalised character. But this guy's gone from, as he calls it, a hardcore atheist, and picked up Eastern Orthodoxy, which, when you talk about tradition in religion, hasn't, okay, I won't say hasn't evolved, is a form of Christianity that has retained its traditions probably more than any of the other elements. And as he points out, it it's not something that sets out to make you feel warm and fuzzy. It's a an orthodox thing. It's the faith that they put out. So there is a trend. Um, there is a trend as it's moving, and to see the media pick up on it now, and even from services like this, it's not showing the entire movement, but it's showing the tip of movement. It's showing that there is a movement. There is a shift taking place. Does that mean we're going to see organised religions pick up their numbers again? I don't know. Not necessarily a return to that. But I mean, when I head out to dog training on a Sunday morning, it is noticeable that the evangelical churches that are nearby, their car parks are now overflowing. 10, 15 years ago, you'd have maybe a handful of cars in the car park on a Sunday morning, and they're probably the retirees and the geriatrics hanging on, and as they aged out or passed away, there wasn't new families or new people coming into the faith. Something's happened in the last 10 or 15 years, and maybe more so in the last 5 years. There's a shift, and I think a lot of the change is a younger population, and that's not just near where I live. When I've travelled um, elsewhere in the country, uh, that's people have said the similar thing to me as well, is that the empty car parks on a Sunday morning suddenly are overflowing, and the places are filled with young families, and um, the idea that the nuclear family unit is not desirable. Well, there's an undercurrent of, well, I guess it attracts a nuclear type family, but there are growing numbers. Whether that's reflected with big changes in the community, again, yet to wait and see. But it was interesting. So he's another character who was without faith, who's now arrived in the Pentecostal church, which is okay. That's a bit of a jump, but again, it's coming forward. I mean, it says there's a decline, but uh, self-reported statistics are weird. It's like percentages of the population that are based on self-identified characteristics. I think there's some misleading statistics out there. People feel either obliged to commit to a position that they don't fundamentally believe in, or uh, feel obliged to hide what they believe in because it would not be accepted societally, which I think is a problem. I mean, I'd rather people be open about it. So yeah, no, it was interesting to see it appear on SBS, and um, white Australian. Okay, it's yeah, it's interesting. Um, especially when a lot of immigrants keep their faith, don't leave their faith. I mean, a similar sort of thing happened in the past. A lot of immigrants, when they came out, kept their faith. Um, but no, I thought that was a very interesting article when that came up. All right, back onto a high horse that I've been talking about the last couple of days about the difficulties with not migration, but the problems of poor infrastructure support and what that means uh, to urban planning, to settlement, um, regionally in particular, and how there's difficulty supporting the existing population and how that's going to be amplified as we're trying to increase the population through various means. So again, SBS piped up with an article this morning about the need to increase the supply of skilled workers into regional Australia, well, everywhere really. And that goes back as well to the migration. Not every migrant coming in, it comes in on a skilled visa or has been targeted for their skill set. And I mean, even if every migrant coming in was on the skilled visa, there'd probably still be a shortfall with that. It then comes down to distribution and having access to services and blah, 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 blah. Now, again, because of its focus as being a multicultural media service, the people it's talking, most of the people it's talking to who are these skilled workers arriving into regional regions are people from either recent migrants or from migrant background, which also means difficulties for them, not just coming into the country, but also getting work and everything else. The the fact they're talking about regional Australia in the Hunter region, I mean, that's still pretty close to the major cities. That's like bedroom community type thing. I mean, Muswellbrook, yeah, okay, except that it's called um, regional, it's almost coastal. It's a bit different when you're only an hour, half an hour from Newcastle and a couple of hours from Sydney. Uh, it, it it's changed over time. I mean, Goulburn, as an example, used to be seen as a completely rural town, as a regional centre. As the highway between Sydney and Melbourne kept being upgraded and people had and transport links were improved and people realised that commuting from Western Sydney or the outer city suburbs into Sydney jobs was taking them 3 odd hours a day, the attractiveness of places like Goulburn as a place to live but still commute to Sydney suddenly became a lot more attractive, and places like Colotop and Bargo and other places in the Southern Highlands where the road links were pretty good, you suddenly had explosions in population because they effectively became satellite suburbs of Sydney. Yes, technically they're still in regional Australia. Yes, they sometimes lack the higher end infrastructure and services, but their position as a pure regional town or city doesn't exist as much anymore. It's like saying Wollongong was a standalone place um, when I was growing up. I knew kids who commuted daily on the train from Wollongong to it was Sydney Boys High School, which is right in the centre of the city, just off Hyde Park. And for them, it was a shorter commute from Wollongong to the CBD in Sydney every day and back than it was for some of their classmates who came in from Campbelltown or Bankstown. And it's like, but you're living in what's nominally a separate city. When things are that closely connected, I don't know that you can necessarily call it independently regional as much anymore. That being said, the concerns raised do still apply to places that are well and truly regional, like Orange or Dubbo or, well, I won't say Newcastle because I think Newcastle's too close. The other bigger centres like Armidale, Wagga Wagga, Albury, mainly New South Wales places because it's what I know. But yeah, so she's surprised. It seems that she's surprised about how well she's been accepted into the community and integrated, which says to me a little bit that she believed the whole Australians are racist, you're not going to be accepted, people hate you, blah, 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 blah. And what I was saying the other day was that even in these small towns, as long as you're part of the social fabric, people accept you. They don't mind. Everyone's got their own secrets. You're just another person. Um, the fact that she's also providing an essential service probably doesn't hurt, which is good. But the difficulty, and this comes down to, I mean, GPs is a big one. You hear cases of all sorts of insane pay packages being offered for a GP in really regional Australia because it's hard to retain them. They'll come for a couple of years, but the money and quality of life and stuff is so much easier in the bigger cities. So they'll hang around regional areas for a little bit and then drift back to the bigger cities, where it's also easier for them to refer to specialist services and things like that. So it's the first problem is encouraging them to arrive. The second problem is once they've arrived, how do you hang on to them? Um, and I mean, if there's no midwifery support in the region, well, you can't have kids where you can. It's just an acceptance that the quality of infrastructure and access to services is going to be less. Uh, Now, should it be higher? Yeah, I think so. Is it going to be? Yeah, unlikely. I mean, it, it's not a perfect world. You're not going to have a inner city trauma department in every regional hospital or anything like that. It just doesn't work that way. And so there's going to be a degree of loss of service. But that also then ties into the difficulty of living in regional Australia, that if you have to attend specialist treatment like cancer support, things like that, chances are you have to travel and travel a long way to get that. Um, so, I mean, when I was born, I wasn't born in the town we lived in. Mum had to go to the nearest hospital, which was at least one town over. But yeah, that's just what happened. Um, and it talks about, okay, yeah, there's jail systems up there, but the lack of mental health services. Again, we talked yesterday, we're talking about veteran healthcare in the ACT because of the article that the ABC had. It specifically mentioned the lack of psychiatric support in the ACT, or available psychiatric support in the ACT, and that people were having to go to Sydney and Melbourne to get assistance. Now, Muswellbrook is a lot smaller than Canberra, and Canberra is, like I said, capital city, seen as city, but in practical terms, it's a large regional centre. It has access to, yep, more specialists than most regional centres, but there are still things where the the supply of specialists is just not enough, and people have to travel to Sydney or Melbourne, which Canberra also then sucks up the need from people who live regionally next to it as well. So yeah, sometimes people have to bounce across two or three services before having to go to one of the other capital cities to get health services. So mental health services, again, the fact that Muswellbrook's having an issue with it, not a surprise, to be honest, not a surprise. You'd be hard pressed to find a regional area that has well-funded, well-supported, well-developed mental health infrastructure. And drug and alcohol services tend to be associated with that. Those sort of substance abuse problems tie into mental health quite often. And, well, drug and alcohol services everywhere are kind of lacking. Um, so, I mean, the mayor there says exactly what I've just been talking about, the fact that it's a near impossibility to get these sort of services in location. Uh, and the point that isn't covered there as well is these regional centres provide services to their surrounding area. So there's smaller towns and settlements that would never have these services, and they have to travel to the regional centres um, to get that sort of support. So, like in the Northern Rivers area of New South Wales, um, what's the name of the city? Lismore is where the big regional hospital is and has um, very well developed services and support, but they can't cover every eventuality. If you have more complex needs, you end up going to Brisbane, to one of the major hospitals up there, or maybe even the Gold Coast. But Lismore Hospital is an aggregator for the area, and so you have smaller hospitals, Grafton, Maclean, um, places like that. They'll feed their more complex patients up to Lismore, um, and because they're smaller towns slash cities, and they don't have again the depth of support and infrastructure. And then you go further down the pipeline to more farming settlements or even beach towns where they don't have hospitals, and so you've got this sort of pipeline feeding people from where they live, maybe up 3 or 4 stops to finally get to the level of care they require. And so you could go from a beach town into a more regional centre to get to the hospital that's then fed into Lismore because it's got access to the better services. And then you're fed from Lismore either to Sydney or to Brisbane because it can't provide the services. That's just the way the cookie crumbles. You're not going to have full level of support everywhere. So, I mean, it is good to see that the governments are trying to address things like that, trying to um, attract higher skilled workers into regions and give them connectors and infrastructure support. So we were talking about the other day, so those greenfield suburbs that are lacking infrastructure connections and everything else. And it talks about the difficulty of people arriving into situations where they're lacking these supports. They need to have this additional support network as they're arriving and settling in. And so, yeah, again, it talks to the immigrant community about what's going on and how these additional support services are providing a good settlement into Australia for them. And again, we go back to that problem of the suburbs that are being built without access to infrastructure like this or without a government system that's bringing things forward. Now, it talks about obviously issues associated with the major employment in the region. It's a coal mining region and they're moving away from coal mining, and so they're going to have major shifts in employment in the region in coming years, maybe even depopulation because people will move out of the area looking for work elsewhere. So it'll be interesting, and it'll also be interesting to see hopefully that the integration into the community remains for these people from foreign nations. Supporting that as well is a discussion about how skilled migration. You're looking for skilled migrants, not just white collar professionals in terms of doctors, engineers, lawyers, etc., but also blue collar trades. You're looking for skilled tradesmen, plumbers, chippies, sparkies, that sort of thing. And traditionally in Australia, there was, um, well, back when I was a kid, the TAFE system as it is didn't exist. They were vocational education schools. They were arts institutes. Um, they were, uh, I mean, people went and did their apprenticeships and things like that directly with um, the tradesmen, and so picked up their tickets, picked up their qualifications that way, did their apprenticeships through a system that has been around for hundreds of years. But not everybody who went through the schooling system was going to go into years 11 and 12. It used to be considered that years 11 and 12 were preparing people for a move into university and therefore into white collar jobs after that. If you're going to go on to be a tradie or work vocationally, you'd generally stop after year 10 once you turn 16 and head off into the other institutes. The TAFE, Technical and Further Education, is what it stands for, system, at least in New South Wales, sort of came along and replaced those arts institutes and other systems and provided a more formalised training of vocational training. It provided a standardisation so that a welder being trained in an apprenticeship in one place would have the same skill set and the same quality uh, of like the ability to do the same welds to the same quality as a welder in another place. It provided more portability of jobs. So it wasn't a case of, oh, I trained in this location, but another location considers all those people barely advanced Neanderthals, therefore you're unskilled. It allowed you to take a more consistent skill set out into the workplace. Now, each state had that individually for a while, and then eventually there was a push towards nationally accredited training and a nationally recognized progression syllabus system, training system sort of thing. I still forget the exact terminology used. I used to write syllabuses at one point, but eventually there was a graded system or a system that was created so that if you left school and went did a certificate level course, people would understand where a Cert 1 to 4 fit compared to a diploma, compared to a graduate diploma, to an advanced diploma, to a bachelor's degree, a master's, and doctorate, and things like that. It provided a smooth pathway, not pathway, a smooth progression in um, expected outcomes for people. And it also then meant that you could take your training interstate, you could take your certification interstate and prove to the state you're moving to the employers and stuff, that yep, you were capable of working at a given standard, at a given level of competency, because you'd met those standards elsewhere and had them recognised. Now, there was obviously a big push for more people to go to university, moving to these high-paying jobs, etc., with the unfortunate effect that fewer people were going into trades. Of the people going to trades, a lot of them were heading into the mining sector because there was a lot of money in natural resources at the time. And so fly in, fly out workers and stuff, people who just qualified as tradesmen were, yeah, earning big bickies working in the mines, which meant that the availability to domestic services or even to industrial and commercial, yeah, people were struggling for that. But it's good to see, though, that we've now got, apparently there's a bit of a change, that not that university enrolments are declining, because the universities are also suffering, The ANU in particular is having um, a big set of upset people at their financial viability. They really got screwed around a bit in recent years, and so they're struggling to work out what to do with student numbers and delivery of services and research and everything else. They lost their way for a bit, and the declining rate of university entrances, well, that might reduce the entrance ranking required to uh, 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 get accepted into various courses, which will only further help make university further available to a broader range of students who can then attend the courses they might have wanted to do, as opposed to the ones that they're able to get on the course list for. But also, by going more people into vocational training systems and vocational training services, it means that people are entering the workforce quicker. It means that they're entering with um, appropriate certificates, trades, qualifications for the workplace they need. Not everybody needs to come out as a fully fledged professional engineer. There's still going to be technicians and tool and die makers and draftsmen, draftspeople, a whole wealth of infrastructure and support that enables the professional engineer to do their job, or that the professional engineer relies upon to deliver the outcomes. But to have those people, they need to go through their training systems, not necessarily all a university system. So it's um, interesting that it's down 22% from before COVID, which is quite a lot, which then obviously causes issues for the, I mean, if you lost, well, the domestic students, so if you lost 22% of your income uh, in what should be a fairly stable year, yeah, you're going to look elsewhere to how to make that up. And if there's no um, foreign students coming in, usually full fee paying, your revenue streams are going to face a bit of a hit, quite a hit. But it is good to see people coming through these technical systems. Last set of tradies I was talking to, a couple of them had apprentices working for them. One of them had an apprentice that had started with them, but didn't realise the degree of physical labour required for that particular role, and so had quit. And others, well, yeah, some trades seem fairly well staffed. Others seem to be struggling for apprentices, and a lot of the tradies that currently work there are starting to age out. Plus, the number of tradies in a given region is also going to be, and availability is going to be influenced by what's happening. There's a lot of building work going on. Uh, then the tradies tend to go that way more than maintenance and repairs elsewhere. It pays better, it's easier to do, better money, less work. So I don't blame them for that. But trying to get hold of a plumber when entire new suburbs are being built and plumbers are in demand there, it's, yeah, very, very difficult. So it's good to see this shift and increase of numbers. I mean, that's interesting. So TAFE enrolments in New South Wales over 400,000 in end of 2024. The national domestic student enrolment in 2023 was 396,000. Hmm. I didn't realise the numbers were that much different. But I mean, there's people go and do short courses and things like that. They're generally offered at a TAFE or a tech system, a tech college. Uh, I mean, most states have a TAFE. I think Canberra's is called Canberra Institute of Technology, so Tech Institute. Um, never got to the TAFE system, but yeah. So programs, short courses, you can be qualified out and doing things sometimes in a matter of months. Um, Generally more flexible to allow people to work while studying. So yeah, it's good to see, I think. Well, I think it's good to see because it obviously talking about the infrastructure burden coming forward and how long a lead time we need to have to implement the infrastructure and support growing populations, support services in regional areas. Uh, yeah, it's good to see that, but we're still talking years of lead time to get these things up and running. The last thing to talk about today is this article that popped up about places in Sydney. Now, it's talking about Sydney, but this is an issue that, well, covers everywhere. Uh, that talks about where there is a lack of social housing in Sydney and where there's well, I wouldn't say an oversupply. I think most people involved with social housing would say there is no such thing as an oversupply, but where there is a greater percentage of social housing uh, and not in other regions. Now, the idea here that's being put forward is that there'd be 5% of social housing in at least 5% social housing in pretty much most suburbs, and it's talking about higher amenity access. So again, we talk about access to higher quality services, um, better access to services. They're talking about inner city, wealthy North Shore and northern beaches further up the Central Coast. So places with money. Funny that they don't want social housing around them. That wouldn't be class-based issues now, would it? There was something I was talking about on one of the pre-stream streams where we were looking at the change in social housing in uh, some locations. Well, I was talking about it in terms of Canberra because they've only recently had it's only been fairly recent there that they've had this. So going back 20 to 30 years, 20 years, the public housing, there were houses scattered through the suburbs, but there were also high density blocks of flats um, in closer to the city. Not that Canberra really has a city, um, that were a blight. People regarded them as an eyesore. They weren't very well maintained. It seemed like there was not much of an interest in keeping them up to modern standards. Obviously, there were a portion of people housed there who had significant societal and health issues, which didn't help them maintain their own living space. And then there were also apartment blocks along Northbourne Avenue as you went northwards out Belconnen towards Belconnen. Gungahlin didn't exist at the time. As the as Civic underwent a fairly massive investment of money and they built much larger shopping centres and did a lot to overhaul the city centre, such as it was. Eventually, those tower blocks or the blocks of flats, which were very, very close to services, got torn down and replaced with with uh, normal residential flats, apartments, high-end residential apartments because of proximity to services and everything demanded a higher price. Likewise, as they were pushing the light rail system into, well, after they built Gungahlin, they hadn't upgraded the roads very well. So you had tens of thousands of people trying to use a single small access road to get into the city and out. They eventually brought in the light rail system that serviced Gungahlin through into the city. But there were blocks of flats along Northbourne Avenue that also got torn down. Again, because they weren't very well maintained, etc. And in their place, high-end apartments got built. The cynical observer would have said that this was being done because those public housing tenements occupied very, very prime real estate, and that it was a problem for the residents, other residents who already lived in those areas, because it dragged down what was already very high property prices. The solutions that came out wasn't a tear down and replace and move the residents back in. It was more to salt and pepper the social housing across the rest of the suburbs. And so what you have is a range of dedicated housing or uh, medium density apartments or townhouses being built through existing suburbs and then designating them as public housing and putting people in there. So you've moved people around the city, around the ACT, and taken them sometimes away from where they always lived to places where they've got no connection. Given the wait list for public housing, people wouldn't have complained because otherwise you lose your house, you lose your accommodation. The other drawback, I mean, the benefit for people who used to live near the other um, previously torn down places is, oh, well, their property values went up. Everybody else's property values have gone down because now you've got public housing scattered in the places that wasn't previously there. It also causes an issue for security, policing, all that sort of stuff, because now when you're responding to people who are having crises or who have issues living in society, who are housed in public housing, they're now spread out, and the burden of being able to access them is, well, increased. And if you're not increasing your support services or your first responder services, likewise, then it becomes an issue. And with the way the ACT has approached property crime and things like that, it's set a level of almost an acceptable level of property crime that won't be prosecuted or will only be lightly prosecuted. Yet the communities into which these housing units have been placed, whilst they do their best to continue to maintain a social fabric, all they can do is live with it without resorting to breaking the law themselves. Now, it's not all doom and gloom. I mean, there's some wonderful modern public housing setups that are now exist. Um, People have an opportunity to live more places. Yeah, everyone wants to live in a city or wants to live in certain locations. That can't always happen. I think the supply of housing has slightly increased, which is also good because it's like a 2 to 3 year wait list to get into public housing. But you also then run the risk of moving your underemployed support workers or your underemployed workers out of the areas where they work and need to live, and force them to rely on public transport or other expensive ways of getting back to work, or they become unemployed. Similar things happen in places like Byron Bay, where the cost of property and even availability of rental houses and space is so difficult that um, the average worker, the retail worker, the coffee shop worker, food services, retail, etc., can't afford to live in the town, and so have to either live in a satellite community or house share or find some unknown way of being able to afford to live there because, well, supply of housing is constrained and it's become highly desirable by a lot of rich people. Now, a lot of beach towns have a very similar problem where, especially if they're weekender destinations from big cities, people will move in with lots of money, buy up the desirable properties, first force rents and house prices up and out of reach of the locals who don't work high-paying jobs and so can't afford to live where they work, are being forced out of places where they've always lived. Similar sort of problems. And so there needs to be like a lockdown, or needs to be an enforcement that affordable housing is made available in those regions. Similar problem here with public housing or social housing. They need to be in locations where you have access to healthcare, schools, public transport, jobs, that sort of thing. I've only been saying it the last couple of days. Well, I've been saying it longer than that. I've been saying it the last couple of days on stream. And it talks about how there's an oversupply, well, not an oversupply, a relatively high density of them further west you go. Again, not a surprise. Traditionally, they were the newest suburbs being built. Like I was saying the other day, you see your migrant populations, you see your populations of people who lower income people tend to move in, but uh, that people move to where they can afford to live eventually. And so these are the locations where people end up appearing. Funnily enough, on the map, you look at, okay, that's Sydney Harbour there. Quite clearly, there are inner city suburbs, although Balmain used to be considered um, inner west. But you're talking about Bondi, I mean, Moore Park, Haymarket's inner city, Darling Point's inner city. Uh, yeah, moving out. Doesn't look too bad on the map. I mean, based on how the article's talking about, I know there's all these lack of things. You'd expect there'd be a lot more suburbs showing like that. But, I mean, unsurprisingly, a lot of NIMBYism and that not in my backyard ism. And they talk about that as well, that the more money people have in a suburb, the less likely it is you're going to have a decent supply of public housing or social housing. And um, there you go. Like when you've got more social housing in areas of low economic areas, socioeconomic areas, none and higher, you get systemic disadvantages, ghettoisation. And it's the sort of thing you want to stop because it doesn't just affect um, people of lower socioeconomic status. Well, it kind of does, and that includes immigrants who will often arrive and enter a lower socio-economic level, at least to begin with, while they get established. And then sometimes they never get out of that path. And so, yep, there's obviously people who are like, no, 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 you're not building that in my suburb. And, well, everyone's going, well, at some point you do need to have it. Now, talk about Parramatta as being a success story where you've got urban high density, high amenity, and a fairly large number of social housing uh, availability. But funnily enough, I see Parramatta as, yeah, okay, they see it as Western Sydney. It's almost a second CBD if you've been to Sydney any time in the last few years. Um, yep, obviously you've got the CBD proper, but there are suburbs now that have almost become cities of their own and have their own mini CBDs as well. North Sydney is one, um, Parramatta, down Parramatta Road, uh, Liverpool to an extent. Bankstown is sort of getting there, but I think Parramatta is the big one. Penrith, uh, well, has made the shift from largely rural. Um, the arrival of the Olympics certainly helped push some locations along like that. But yeah, and the issue, I guess, is fairness. You've got to be fair to the residents of social housing and their needs to. Some of them do need to live in those regions to work there or live there, um, and so the infrastructure needs to be there to support them. The housing needs to be there to support them. So yeah, it's ties into all the stuff that was happening over the weekend as well. And the problem is just a lack of availability. Okay, everyone's got a right to belong to a community. So it's again interesting to see that talking about it in related areas, articles continue to appear talking about the requirements, talking about the difficulty of access and stuff at the moment. And not just New South Wales, the last one was talking about Victoria, the one before that was talking about Queensland. There's these issues everywhere, and they're problems that yeah, don't get fixed anytime soon, and it tends to be long enough time frame that a government will have gone through at least one or two elections before the solution is implemented. It takes that long to build and plan and get approvals, yada yada yada. Even if you are the government, uh, it's it doesn't end up as well when you're campaigning for re-election to say we're still working on a project that's causing disruption because it's under construction and won't be delivered for another 5 or 6 years. Very, very few long-term plans like that show up unless it's absolutely critical things get done. We'll see. All right, that does it for today. Bit shorter this morning, but yeah, I think that went okay. Look, I will work on the audio levels. They need to be fixed, but otherwise, I think that was all good. So next stream is going to be tonight. We're looking at continuing our Pillars of Eternity playthrough. We're deep in the DLC for that, and then we'll be once most of that's knocked over, we'll head back into the main game and finish that off. But expect we'll be back hopefully tomorrow morning for a little while at least. I've got a couple of things I have to run around and do, and then again Friday from there. All right, so I won't say it's a very good night because it's not a good night. Big thank you to everyone coming out today. We'll see you all again next stream.